Hello and welcome to the 9 News Business Buzz, where we take up what's happening in business, why and how it impacts you and our economy. I'm 9 News business expert Ryan Frazier and CEO of Frazier Global. I'm joined by Ed Sealover of the Colorado Chamber of Commerce and the editor of the Sum and Substance. Ed, how's it going?
It's going great. As usual, it's busy. Check out tsscolorado.com to see all the latest on business policy news.
I read it every day. Now, Ed, our first topic is new and potentially groundbreaking front in the state's effort to clean up our air. Colorado's Regional Air Quality Council is developing a set of suggestions for potential regulation that would, for the first time, limit emissions from the traffic that businesses attract. This indirect source regulation would target large warehouses and entertainment venues and even Denver International Airport, requiring them to reduce the pollution from the cars and trucks that visit their facilities. Ed, your reporting lays out a new regulatory approach. Instead of focusing on a factory smokestack, the Regional Air Quality Council is looking at the pollution from thousands of cars and trucks going to places, as I said before, like warehouses and concert venues. Can you break down for us what is an indirect source of emissions and which specific types of businesses will this potential set of new rules affect?
Absolutely. First of all, let's break down what a direct source of business is. That is the kind of things they've been regulating for the past 4 years. Oil and gas wells, manufacturing facilities, large commercial buildings, anything that emits emissions. Those are, if you will, the lower hanging fruit. Not easy things to regulate, but you can figure out more easily how to go in and say, you've got to cut out your emissions to this level. An indirect source is a place, as you mentioned, that attracts an awful lot of traffic. And there are 5 of them in particular that the Regional Air Quality Council has been talking about so far. Those are warehouses, colleges, universities, airports, concert venues, and sports stadiums, large concert venues and large sports stadiums, I should say. And what they're asking is, how do we stop so much gas-powered traffic from getting to these places? You'll see kind of more of a concentration of emissions coming out of these areas. And so the idea of an indirect source rule is, what can we do to cut these indirect sources? Not the emissions coming out of warehouses, but the emissions of the people going to warehouses.
Yeah, no, Ed, okay, maybe it's just the business side of me, being a business owner myself, but this sounds like it could have a significant new cost for these businesses. What has been the reaction from the business community, and what are some of the biggest concerns you're hearing from the operators of these large venues and warehouses and other facilities?
Yeah, first of all, we have to understand that these are just suggestions. They're nowhere near the regulation phase yet, but there's a lot of question about how do we implement them, first of all. How do you cut the amount of emissions going into warehouses? We'll take that for an example. One of the biggest ideas is, well, we want to encourage electric vehicles. How do we encourage more electric vehicles going into these warehouses? Well, maybe we could say warehouses of a certain size have to put in electric vehicle chargers. That will encourage trucking companies that are going in there to use them. However, the trucking companies are worried about this. First of all, electrification of large commercial vehicles has been a lot slower right now than electrification of small individual vehicles. And they're saying, if you're going to mandate some sort of electrification, it's going to be problematic. The other thing they say is, please don't cap the amount of emissions that could be coming out of a place like this. You can't say to pretty much any business, we're going to limit the amount of traffic that's coming in there and things are going to be okay. If you limit the amount of traffic going into warehouses, that's less business to warehouses. If you, and this has not been suggested, limit the amount of traffic going to, say, a Broncos game, that's less people that can go to a game and less money that somebody can make from that. So there's a lot of questions about how do we do this within cost. And I will add that airports and colleges are 2 of the main ones saying, look, we already are working on emissions reduction plans. If you're going to do this, let's figure out how much bang for the buck this is going to mean versus what we're already doing. And if the cost of our investment does not equal the return in reductions of emissions, maybe we ought to think twice about what we're doing here.
One of the things that occurs to me as I think about this is, like, how likely is it that it will actually be effective? And I don't know what the conversation has been around that, but these venues and even DIA and others, they only have so much control / influence they can exert on people's willingness to use their vehicles to get to and from places. Where's that conversation centered around? Can this even actually be effective?
Well, right now, the first thing that the RAC, that's the acronym for the Regional Air Quality Council, is saying, before we talk about any kind of either incentives or regulations that could come about, let's talk about measuring it. We want to understand exactly how many emissions are coming from the traffic going into a warehouse, an airport, and to figure out the difference between the emissions emissions coming from traffic going to an airport versus emissions coming from the airplanes at an airport, because you can't really limit that. You can, however, limit the traffic going in there. So the first thing they have to do is figure out what this would mean, and then figure out its effectiveness. So, but they'd like to do that. RACA suggested that's something we could do over the next year or so to measure and to decide, and then maybe talk about, let's do best practices and incentives first, and only after that we should consider the possibility of regulations. But still, you're right about that. This is a big question about how much do you get from this. We've heard this over and over again, specifically with manufacturing facilities. Yes, you can cut our emissions to a certain level, but where does it get to the point where you cut our ability to produce and to produce jobs because of that? Environmental groups say we've got to clean the air, but businesses, and that's true in this case as well, say, look, we've got to make sure that you're not stunting business as well. The Chamber of Commerce is a big advocate. Look, we need to be able to make it easier for businesses to create jobs. If emissions go in place that make it harder to create jobs, I think you may be backfiring on what you're trying to do with these.
Yeah, it seems to me like this is that proverbial, camel's nose under the tent, in terms of suggestions of possible regulations. Now, the Regional Air Quality Control Council is set to present this blueprint to the state's Air Quality Control Commission in November, Ed, if I recall. This seems like a major test case for a new kind of environmental regulation in Colorado. Ed, I'd like to hear your thoughts. What is the long-term significance of this proposal? If it were to move forward, could we see this indirect source model applied to other businesses like retail centers or office parks in the future?
Yeah, let me take that in two parts here. One, when they present this in November, that's going to be when the Regional Air Quality, that's going to be when the Colorado Air Quality Control Commission is going to be considering the state's new SIP. That's the state implementation plan of how we actually take steps, what regulations have to be in place to reduce our emissions. But this is going to be the ideas. You're not going to do this now. This is the ideas going forward. If something like this were to go forward, obviously it opens up a lot of possibilities. And there are places that have looked at some of these rules before that are not mentioned in what the RAC is putting forward. For example, could you do the same thing with construction sites? There's a lot of vehicles going into them. Could you limit those? Could you do the same thing with, as you mentioned, large retail shopping centers? I think this opens the door in a lot of ways. It's important to understand regulating transportation emissions is much harder than regulating direct emissions from sources, but they're still looking at a lot of ways to do that.
All right, Ed, we got to run. The bottom line is that Colorado is exploring new frontiers in air quality regulation that could soon become a new cost of doing business for some of the state's largest operations. We'll be back during the 11 a.m. hour to take up another controversial topic, a new statewide recycling program, and the debate over what recycling means and whether it will be actually effective. Our goal is for you to stay informed, be engaged, and to get ahead of the game. For the 9 News Business Buzz, for Ed Sealover, I'm Ryan Frazier. See you next time.